Okay, so it's been a couple weeks since I have given you guys some lecture material, and that's very much been intentional. Trying to give you guys a little bit of a break from listening to me. But this week we come to a topic that has become one of my favorite topics to discuss, and that is the topic of Watergate. This is a scandal that involves President Richard Nixon, who we're going to talk about. We're going to introduce very briefly before we sort of get into what really was the scandal that defined his presidency, and really kind of set the stage moving forward for really an entire decade, and that is the 70s and on into the early 80s. Um, Again, this is not one of those things that makes the top five list of things that growing up I was really interested in. But as I've taught, U.S. history, this is now the sixth year that I've taught this course. I find it to be one of the more interesting things to talk about, mainly because Nixon is such an interesting character to talk about, regardless of political party. He's just a really interesting guy. He's got some really interesting character traits. And so that's kind of where we're at today is talking about Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. So turning now to the lecture material, you can see the picture there of Nixon. He's a golfer. Generally a pretty big sports fan. I think there's a picture coming up here in a minute. He was a baseball player. He is no stranger to the world stage. He was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 50s. He was a noted communist, sort of, hunter, not obviously to the level of, say, Joseph McCarthy, but certainly when he was in office, in the 50s, he was noted for his pursuit of members of the Communist Party. He then ran for president against John F. Kennedy in 1960 and was defeated by a fairly narrow margin. So he's no stranger to this stage. But here in 1968, sort of out of the ferment that was the 60s, he emerges as the victor in 1968. Now, and this becomes very, very important as we move forward and we get to Watergate, part of the reason that he is elected to office in 1968, or one of the things that he says is the reason that he got elected in 1968, is that he appealed to what he called the silent majority. And this is a term that sort of popped back up in political news stories and analyses here lately because President Trump has also invoked that phrase, silent majority. And essentially, what Nixon said historically, we're not really going to deal with the contemporary use of that because that's sort of outside the purview of this course. But Nixon, the way that he used this term is he said basically, look, there's all this noise, right? We talked a little bit about, you guys read about the rise of the new left and all these protest movements, and there's all these people who say that they're not satisfied and they're not happy with the way the country is being run. And Nixon basically says that's the minority. They just happen to be really, really loud and really, really vocal. There actually exists a vast majority of people who, aside from maybe disagreeing on Vietnam and American policy there, aside from that, they're pretty happy, right? They're just not very vocal. They're silent, right? They're the silent majority. Now, there is some evidence to back that up. Historically, we're not going to dive into it today, but just that idea of a silent majority is going to become pretty important as we move forward here. So, looking specifically at the 70s, and again, we're not going to get into a ton of this because I do want the main focus to be on Watergate. Just suffice it to say that the economy in the 70s is a little bit weaker than it had been in the 1960s because, in the 1960s, we're spending a lot of money. The government is spending a lot of money on Vietnam, those Great Society programs. I think that I referenced in that paper that I had you guys read, Lyndon Baines Johnson had this massive programs that was designed to be sort of the next New Deal sort of thing is the way that he had envisioned it. There's also this thing called stagflation, which is a combination of a stagnant economy. In other words, stagnant meaning it's not moving very much; it's just sort of staying still. Plus increased inflation and high unemployment, and all of that sort of put together is where we get that term stagflation. There's also an oil crisis. You see the picture down here at the bottom from the Shell station that says gas costs an arm and a leg. Premium is going to cost you your firstborn. That's something that I know I can certainly remember gas prices when I was in high school had gotten to a point where they got pretty ridiculous. I just filled up. I have to, because of the vehicle I drive, I have to purchase premium gas. But I filled up just the other day for $2 a gallon, and I haven't been able to do that for years. So certainly we're no stranger even today, contemporarily, or in our contemporary times with high gas prices. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of weakness, at least early on in the 70s, when it comes to the economy. There's the Nixon fun fact. Major League Baseball offered him to be their players representative. He declined. That was in the mid 60s. So again, just kind of a fun fact. He was a sports guy. Nixon's part in Vietnam, and again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Is his goal is to slowly what he called Vietnamize the war effort, which is basically, we're slowly going to pull our troops out. And as we pull our troops out, the South Vietnamese are going to slowly integrate. They're well trained under the watchful eye of American, advisors. They're going to, integrate them into their fighting forces. It was a disaster, essentially, which is kind of that bottom point. There's a ton of Vietnamese refugees that come to the United States, and South Vietnam eventually collapses. You see also in there Kent State in 1970. That sort of accelerated. Kent State was a massacre in Ohio where there was a student protest on the campus of Kent State University, and I believe it was the governor of Ohio, but I could be wrong on that. I apologize. But I believe it was the governor of Ohio sent in National Guard troops just to sort of act as crowd control. One of the troops, I think, gets hit by a rock and fires a shot into a crowd. Other troops sort of hear that shot. They think that they've been fired upon, and so they open fire. I think, if I remember correctly, that's how that went. But again, I hadn't really prepped on Kent State because I wanted to get to Watergate. So again, that's sort of Nixon's plan on Vietnam. It fails utterly and totally. But really, at this point, by the time you get to 68, pretty much any American policy in Vietnam is destined to fail. So that's sort of your little tidbit on Vietnam. There you see Nixon with Elvis Presley. Again, just sort of a sign of the times. Nixon, and this sort of gets overlooked because of all the Watergate stuff that we're about to talk about. Nixon was a phenomenal president when it came to foreign relations, outside, again, of Vietnam. But again, that's kind of an unfair mark to hold against him because, again, nobody was going to have a successful, swing in Vietnam. He continued, he sort of created this policy of détente, which, as you can see there, is sort of this relaxation of relations with the Soviet Union. Again, things had sort of gotten a little heated, sort of on again, off again. And what Nixon does is he, along with Henry Kissinger, who's pictured down here in the bottom left, they come up with this policy called détente, but as a part of that is realpolitik, which is sort of being able to use the current situation of world affairs for political gain, and really sort of setting up smaller victories that can be used to sort of chip away at the whole. So, for example, 1972, Nixon visits China, which is a total shock to the entire world because China is sort of the second leading Soviet power in the world. And here's, Taiwan had been sort of this oddly controlled island. It was not, it wasn't a part of China, but historically it always had been, but it was democratically controlled. So, Taiwan would ship goods to, democratic countries like the United States. Well, now all of a sudden Nixon doesn't visit Taiwan or doesn't just visit Taiwan. He visits mainland China. And you can see the picture down there at the bottom. This is Nixon and his wife at the Great Wall. He visits Mao, and this is sort of seen as Nixon sort of reaching out, right, and acknowledging one of the great communist powers in the world. And then later on in May of '72, partially because of the success of the visit to China, he then visits Moscow and actually talks face to face with the Soviet premier. I believe, it's Brezhnev at this point. And it leads to this just sort of general, relaxation of tension, and sort of a scaling back of the arms race. We haven't really talked about the arms race that much, at least not since we sort of set up the Cold War generally. But the arms race was this idea of, both sides just sort of building up bigger and really scarier weapons. Nixon relaxed that a little bit, right? And he does that with the SALT treaties. But again, that's really sort of outside the area that I wanted to focus on for today. There's also he's going to continue to battle communism, though, in places like Latin America. But again, that's not really what we're after. And again, I apologize. We're sort of blasting through a lot of his domestic policies. Suffice it to say that Nixon actually, again, domestically is fairly successful. As it says there, by his nature, he is, conservative by nature. He seeks to sort of reverse a lot of the liberal trends of the 60s. And he's successful in some aspects. For example, he sort of swings the Supreme Court back conservative. Despite that, the court's going to rule Roe v. Wade, the legalization of abortion. A lot of those more progressive reforms that remained in place. For example, OSHA and things like that. And like a lot of presidents before him, Nixon's not really going to push civil rights as an issue, really for political reasons. So that sort of gets us through our broad sweep of Nixon's administration. Now, and I apologize, I'm not exactly sure where we're at on time. I tried to get through that as quickly as I could, but now we get to Watergate, and you can see the picture there of a parking ticket. The Watergate building is actually a hotel in Washington, D.C. So on our way home from Colonial Williamsburg last summer, we decided to come home sort of in a roundabout way. And so on our way home, we were sort of driving through Washington, D.C., and my wife and I, as we were sitting in traffic just off of the mall there near the Lincoln Memorial, we decided, let's just stop and walk around the National Mall for a couple of hours. And so we tried to find the quickest and most accessible public parking we could. And lo and behold, Google Maps took us to the Watergate Hotel. And so we parked at the Watergate, which was, for me, as a history sort of nerd and geek, was pretty cool. And so my wife sort of laughed at me as I took a picture of the parking ticket that you see there on the slide. Now, in order to understand the significance, though, of the Watergate, we have to have a little bit of the background. So, 1972, and keep in mind that I'm going to give this to you as setup, and then we're going to sort of go back in time a little bit. 1972, Nixon wins re-election, and the map is maybe a little bit difficult to read. I can kind of bring it up here and make it to where you can read it a little bit easier. But suffice it to say, Nixon wins this in an absolute landslide. I didn't want to say it. He wins in an absolute landslide, right? Like, you literally cannot win an election unless you win it unanimously. Like, it's impossible, right? He wins every state except for Massachusetts, the District of Columbia, which not a state, but they have electoral votes. There's one electoral vote from Virginia that goes to the Libertarian candidate. It's a complete and utter just slaughter, right? And you can see Nixon down here is pictured with the fist pump, whatever you want to call that. It's devastating, right? He has this thing called the Southern Strategy. It's wildly successful through the South, obviously. It's just a total shellacking, really, right? Nixon was not going to lose, right? Notice that I haven't even talked about who the guy that he ran against was, because it doesn't matter who he runs against. He could run against probably the ghost of George Washington, and the guy would have won, right? Like, it was a cinch, right? Now, that's all well and good, but what does it have to do with Watergate? So I'm going to sort of go past a little bit of this here. Spiro Agnew is fun to talk about, but we're going to sort of jump ahead, because there's this thing out there. It's a group. It's kind of a shadow group, and it's called CREEP, right? Which is sort of an odd sounding name for a committee that would be under the auspices of the president. But you can see there, CREEP stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President. And you can see there, they're going to use a ton of these smear tactics, right? This is not just a group that is. Watergate is not the only thing that this group does, right? And again, we're sort of building to what Watergate actually was. But this guy named Daniel Ellsberg was a guy who leaked this thing called the Pentagon Papers that sort of revealed a lot of the really nasty stuff that our military had done in Vietnam. That happens during the Nixon administration. I think that's 1970. The Pentagon Papers are leaked. And so CREEP is going to go in. They actually break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and use the things that they found there to sort of discredit him, or to try to discredit him, rather. That's the kind of stuff that this group does, right? CREEP's main goal is to make sure that the president looks good, right? Now, why would a president want to do this? Well, aside from the obvious, right? He's the president and he wants to look good, right? Aside from that, a major character trait, I'm not going to call it a flaw, although many would call it a flaw, but a major character trait of Richard Nixon is that he is super paranoid. And I cannot emphasize that enough. It's unbelievable how paranoid this guy was. If we were together corporately as a class, we would watch this documentary. It's about a guy named Dick Cavett, who he was. If you imagine any of your late night talk show hosts, like for me, it would be like Jay Leno or David Letterman. But I think now it's like Conan, or I'm trying to think of the other guy's name, the one that just drives me up a wall, and I can't think of him now. But anyway, those guys that host those late night talk shows, that's who Dick Cavett was. He was a comedian, right? But he would bring on these relatively important people and just sort of talk to them, and they would laugh with him, and they would crack wise and all that kind of stuff. Well, he ended up actually uncovering a lot of what's about to happen. And he interviewed a reporter who actually had a really solid relationship with Nixon. And this reporter, was talking to this Cavett fellow, and he tells Cavett about this conversation that he had with Nixon. And he says that he asked him, he said, Mr. President, do you ever feel like you can just sort of let your hair down? And what he means by that is, do you ever find that you can just relax with anybody, right? That you don't have to like be the president, or you don't have to like be so cautious and so careful. And Nixon says to this reporter, he says, no, there's no one. And the reporter says to him, what about Pat? Now, Pat Nixon is his wife, right? Do you ever feel like you can just relax around your wife and just sort of be yourself around your wife? And the reporter says, Nixon thinks for a second, and then he says, no, not even around Pat. That's how paranoid this guy is, right? It's just unfathomable, right? Now, what does this have to do with creep, and what does it have to do with Watergate? Well, as you can see there in that fourth bullet point, one of the things that John Mitchell, who is pictured there smoking the pipe, one of the things that John Mitchell and his group would do is they would hire these people that they called plumbers. And the job of a plumber was to fix leaks, right? Like Daniel Ellsberg, for example. So as we move towards the election of 1972, that one that Nixon, it did not matter who he ran against. He was going to win. And it's almost certain that he had advisors that told him, Mr. President, you're going to win. You're insanely popular right now. The Democrats could run, the cutest puppy dog that you could ever imagine against you, and it does not matter. You're going to win, right? As that election draws closer, Nixon starts to get paranoid. Well, what if I lose? What if something happens? What if the economy tanks and people blame me? What if what if the Democrats pick somebody who people like better than me, right? Because the Democrats wouldn't have selected their candidate yet. So he starts to get super, super paranoid, right? So what the Watergate scandal is this. It's the Nixon administration it says they're trying to cover up a burglary, right, at the Watergate Hotel. Now, the problem is that this is not exactly a burglary, right? What they're actually doing, these five guys, and it doesn't matter that you can't see the fifth guy's face because of me, but there's a fifth guy there. These five guys are arrested. And they're arrested. Initially, it's reported, they were breaking and entering into the Watergate Hotel. Well, they weren't actually breaking and entering, because when you're breaking and entering, you break into a place and you're taking stuff, right? No. What these guys were doing is they were leaving stuff. And what they were doing is they were leaving bugs, right? The reason that they were trying to wiretap or tap phones and photograph documents is because the Democratic National Committee, which is it's basically the group of Democrats that's going to run the campaign for whoever the Democratic candidate was going to be. And again, they haven't selected it yet. They haven't selected who the candidate's going to be yet. Their headquarters is in the Watergate Hotel. So what these guys are doing is they're planting listening devices so that they can listen to the conversations that are taking place over the phone, but also in just the office buildings. And they're taking pictures of documents pertaining to the strategy of the Democratic Party as to how they're going to attack Nixon, right? This is highly illegal, right? Not much is made about it at first because these guys keep quiet about it, right? And I'm going to kind of stop there because when we get together in class on Wednesday, I want to kind of talk about the cover-up. Now, I'll just say this, that the Kennedy assassination is sort of a super popular thing to talk about in history because it's kind of interesting, right? Because of the conspiracy theories and things like that. For me, this is actually almost as interesting because of the different stuff that they're going to try to do to cover this up. Now, in your 3-2-1, um, in your 3-2-1, I want you to think a little bit about what is some of the information. I want you to think about it, and you'll probably want to write it as either one of the things that you learned or one of the things that you found surprising. Probably one of the things that you found surprising. Why do you think these guys would want to listen into these conversations from the Democratic Party, even though they hadn't picked their candidate yet? Right? I want you to think about that a little bit. What advantage does this actually give you? Okay, there's got to be a reason that these guys were trying to bug this office, but what is that reason? What are they looking to actually gain here? Okay, that's what I want you to write about in your 3-2-1 for this week. And again, we're going to sort of get the second half of the story in class on Wednesday. So, with that being said, I'm going to stop here for now, and I hope to see you all in class on Wednesday.